That song really leads us into our theme for this month of November as we focus on eternity and the end times and the end times parables of Jesus and so forth. And so that's kind of our theme. Our theme scripture for today comes from Psalm 36, verses 7 and 8, where King David writes, "How priceless is your unfailing love, O God. People take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house. You give them drink from the river of delights." Let's read that together. "How priceless is your unfailing love, O God. People take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house. You give them drink from the river of delights." Just a great description of God and of God's relationship with us. We're doing some parable preaching in these 3 weeks of November, these last 3 weeks of November. And parables are earthly stories with heavenly meanings. Sometimes we use modern day stories and we see what God can teach us in those. But today we're going back to Jesus stories. To Jesus stories, particularly in Matthew 25. And so we're calling the series the End Times Parables of Jesus. Because Matthew 25 is almost the end of Jesus' life. By Matthew 28, Jesus is risen from the dead, so Matthew 25 is getting close to his death. So it's the end times for Jesus. It's his last words with his disciples. But it's also, the parables are about the end times, about Jesus' return and all that kind of thing. So let's listen to today's story. Matthew 25, verse 14. "Again, it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. And then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. 'Master,' he said, 'you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. Look, I have gained 5 more.' And his master replied, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness.' Then the man who had 2 bags of gold also came. 'Master,' he said, 'you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. Look, I've gained 2 more. And his master said, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness.' Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. 'Master,' he said, 'I knew you were a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. I was afraid. I went out, hid your gold in the ground. See, here's what belongs to you.' And his master replied, 'You wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed? Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. For whoever has will be given more, and they will live in abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have, will be taken from them. Throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" And that's the end of that story from Jesus. So just a couple observations to begin with. First of all, this parable, some of you may be familiar with it, I don't know, is often called the parable of the talents, because the Greek word for the amount of gold given to each of these servants is the word talent. Talent was a unit of measurement for money, for gold. And so the first guy got 5 talents. It's the amount of gold he got. The second guy, 2 talents. Third guy, 1 talent. So a talent of gold was about what a laborer could earn in half a lifetime. So if we translate that to today's dollars, if someone's working at Hobby Lobby, let's say, for $20 an hour or whatever it is, in half a lifetime of 40-hour work weeks, the person would earn $800,000. So the first guy, if you multiply it out, got $4 million. And the second guy got $1.6 million. And the third guy got only $800,000, which is a whole heck of a lot, actually, when you think about it. So I'm kind of getting off my point about the amounts. But the reason I don't like to call this parable of talents, because talent has a different meaning in English, which you know what that meaning is. I got a talent to do this, play guitar or sing, or I got a talent to bake, or I got a talent to run a business, or whatever the talent is. But this parable has nothing to do with that kind of talents. It has to do with gold, with money, with amounts of money And so I think our translation, the New International Version, translates it well. Parable of the bags of gold. All right? Second observation is that there's not three different kinds of servants. There's only two different servants because the first two are really the same. Look at Matthew 25, verse 16. The man who received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more. So also the one with 2 bags. In other words, they react the same way. They're the same, just different amounts of gold. But the third guy is different. Matthew 25, 18 says, but the man who had received 1 bag, blah, 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 blah. So the third, it's really 2 kinds of people. First 2 are really one, and then the third guy is the opposite, different. The third guy is the one who went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. So what is the heavenly meaning to this parable? What's the spiritual, what are we supposed to get out of this for life in God's kingdom? Well, initially, the first thing that jumps out at me, pretty simple, is that the man going on a journey, the master, that's God. That's Jesus, specifically, who's going to go away from his disciples in a few days. And is going to go on a journey, if you will, and then come back. So that's pretty simple. But after that, it gets pretty hard. So I'm going to kind of take you on a little journey here, and I hope you can follow along. What's pretty hard, in my opinion, is what's the gold? What's being talked about here? What is the point Jesus is making? Maybe a thought would be that this parable is about how we handle finances. After all, it is bags of gold. So maybe what this parable is about is that God gives us different amounts of money. That's true, actually, right? Some have more, some have less. Maybe the parable, what Jesus is trying to teach us is we need to be careful with our money. Careful with how we manage God's money, because it's really his. He's just given it to us. Make sure that we multiply his money, which kind of sounds like a TV preacher almost. I don't know that Jesus is a TV preacher. But if we don't manage it right, then we're going to get kicked out of God's kingdom and go to hell. That doesn't sound exactly like a biblical conclusion, does it? So maybe it's not really gold. Maybe the gold represents something else. So maybe the gold is talents. There's that word again. Maybe it is English talents. Like maybe what the gold is supposed to be about is that God gives each of us different abilities, we'll say. Different gifts to be able to use for him. And so we have to manage those talents in a way, those abilities in a way that will multiply them for God's kingdom, whatever that means, and not hide them in the ground. If we hide our abilities in the ground and don't use them for God's kingdom, we're going to get kicked out of heaven. We're going to get kicked, we're going to wind up going to hell if we don't use our abilities. Wait a minute. That sounds a little strange too. Millie, I thought there was a pastor who talks about how we're saved by God's grace. Don't you remember that, Millie, or is my hearing aid messing up? Yes, Frank, I remember. Every Sunday, pastor talks about how Jesus died on the cross for us and we're saved by God's grace. So how can it be that we're kicked out of heaven because we don't do good stuff? All right, enough voices. Okay, so, but seriously though, I mean, that's kind of where the parable leads us, and it leads us in kind of in a way, bad direction. It's a direction that contradicts what we know to be true from the rest of Scripture. It contradicts what we know to be true from the words of Jesus, from the words of Paul, from the whole New Testament. Ephesians chapter 2 says, it's by grace you've been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it's a gift of God, not by what you do, so that no one can boast. And yet it seems like what happens here in this parable is the guy gets reprimanded and sent to hell because he hid the gold away and didn't do whatever he's supposed to do. Doesn't that sound like the opposite would be we're saved by what we do? But yet that can't be true, because the Bible tells us we're saved by grace, not by what we do. So this is becoming a very confusing parable. And if I think about this parable as being saved by what we do, or how, am I the guy with the 5 talents? I like to think I did a good job with what God's given me. So then that's boasting. Or am I worried that maybe I'm the guy with the 1 talent and I'm hiding my ability or whatever that gold is in the ground, and I'm worried I'm going to go to hell, and it leads me to, it's just, okay, I'm done preaching now, so I don't know what it means is the point. So, no, I'm just kidding. But that's kind of where you get to after a while. What is going on with this parable? Because one of the principles of biblical interpretation is that the Bible does not contradict itself. And yet if I go that direction with it, which is where I went with it at first, then that makes the Bible contradict itself. The Bible's clear we're saved by God's grace, that it's not by what we do. And so this parable cannot mean that, well, if we do good things, God will save us, and if we don't do whatever this thing is, then God's going to send us. That can't be what the parable's talking about. There has to be something else. So let's look again at Matthew 25, verse 20 and 21. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. And his master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. If this guy, the guy with the 5 or the 2 bags of gold, were to describe his master to a friend, what words would he use to describe his master? We're going to do an exercise. You're going to be part of this. Turn to your neighbor, whoever's next to you, whatever, and tell them in a couple words what comes to mind. How would you, really, I'm asking you to do this now. What's your sense of how this guy would describe the character of his master? I heard generous. Did you tell that to Dick or just me? Oh, you told it to Ron too? Okay. All right. What else? Trusting? Smart, kind, caring, right? There's a good relation. There's obviously a good relationship there. In fact, the master says, come and share your master's happiness, right? So generous, happy, kind. There's just this beautiful relationship going on between these first 2 guys and their master, right? Okay, now let's skip to the second guy. We'll skip the second guy. Go to the third guy. Matthew 25, verse 24. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew you were a hard man, harvesting where you've not sown and gathering where you have not even scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went out and hid your gold in the ground. So same exercise. Look at the person next to you. How would this third person describe their master to someone else? What do you think? I hear a lot of murmuring. I'm not sure if you're ordering pizza or describing the master. I'm hoping you're describing the master there. Here's what came to my mind here. I knew you were a hard man, harvesting where you've not sown, gathering where you've not scattered. I was afraid. I picture this guy, if he was to describe his master, he would say, my master's like a mafia don. He's a hard man. It's a bad relationship. I was afraid because you go out and you take stuff from other people. You don't even have to sow seed. You just steal it. Like that's who you are. You're just a hard taskmaster. He's afraid. Remember, the master is Jesus. The master is God, right? You can tell the relationship is completely different. The view of God from this third person is completely different than those first 2. This third person views God as a hard taskmaster, a mafia don. As I thought about that, I thought, there's another parable of Jesus, my favorite parable actually, where I see the same distinction happening. The third guy in this parable is kind of like, I don't know if you know the story, but the parable of the prodigal son. There's 2 sons in that parable of the prodigal son. There's a younger son, and then there's an older son. And what happens in that story is the younger son goes off and wastes his dad's money, but comes home and finds that his dad is welcoming him home. His dad is smiling, generous, kills the fattened calf for him. See, the relationship of the younger son in the parable of the prodigal son is kind of like the first 2 guys here. And then the older son in the parable of the prodigal son does not want to welcome that younger son home. The older son reacts badly when the father welcomes him home. Listen to what happens to the older son. The older brother becomes angry and refused to go into the party. So his father went out and pleaded with him, but he said to his father, look, all these years I've been slaving away for you. See it? His dad's like a mafia don and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. Doesn't that sound like the third guy in today's parable, his attitude toward God? The third guy in our parable today doesn't know that God's a God of grace. He doesn't see God as a God of grace. That's why he does what he does. His actions demonstrate his relationship with his master. His actions, the burying of the gold is not the actual problem here. The actual problem is the relationship between this guy and his master, or between this guy and God in the spiritual realm. His actions reveal the problem. And the problem is that there's a lack of relationship between this third guy and his master. He doesn't see his master as a master of grace and blessing. And so, what Jesus is saying here is, this is speaking the words of God here, if you view me as Don Corleone, if you view me as a God who's like a mafia don, who's just out to get you and out to judge you, out to condemn you, then that's how things are going to be between us. But if you view me like the first two, as a God of grace and mercy and kindness and generosity, that's how things are going to be between us. And so the end times question for us today as we read this parable is, as we wait for the return of Jesus, is how do you view God? How do you view God? That's what the parable is driving at. What's your relationship with God like? Is your relationship with God based on God as one who's good and kind, who sacrificed his own son for you, who loves you and is generous with you? Or is your relationship with God that God's a hard taskmaster, just giving us all these rules to do and all that kind of stuff? He's like a mafia don. My sense is, for myself, as I thought about that I'm tempted to view God as a hard taskmaster. Because I'm conscious of my sin, I'm conscious of my failings before God. And we all live in a world that rewards good behavior and punishes bad behavior. We're all tempted to be like the older son in that other parable, the parable of the prodigal son, to view God as a hard man. And it's crucial for us how we view God, because it affects then how we use his gifts in the kingdom of God as well. If we view God as this hard taskmaster, then we're going to just view serving him with it's going to be a grudging thing. We're going to be just not wanting to do it. We're going to serve him begrudgingly. We're going to be like this last man because God's a hard taskmaster. It's going to change how our lives are lived. So Jesus calls us to change our view of God, to view God as a God of love, as a generous God who gave his own son for us, to delight in God. I love King David's view in Psalm 36. How priceless is your unfailing love, O God. People take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house. You give them drink from your river of delights. When we take that view of God, it changes how we live. It changes how we use our abilities. It changes how we use our money. Whatever the bags of gold are, it changes that. Because serving God becomes a joy. Because God's a God of love and goodness. And so our 5 bags of gold become 5 more, and our 2 bags of gold become 2 more. And the master replies, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come, share your master's happiness. That's who God is. And that's how he wants us to view him. Let's stand.